Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we want to talk about USB drives, and I know right now there's going to be a bunch of you watching this going, this might be the dullest thing I've ever heard.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
Rob, it is 2024. We've got consumer grade AI these days. We've got cars that can pretty much drive themselves. We've even got bum bags that are actually cool to wear. What on earth are you doing talking about USB drives in 2024? But, frankly, despite all of the changes, innovation and technological improvements that have occurred in the last few decades, it has to be said that even now, in 2024, USB drives are still a thing, whether it is for convenience of backing up your data on the fly, or because your consumer grade devices, your PCs, your laptops, your PlayStation 5s, all of those devices still have a wide degree of support of USB. There's every possibility that the reason you have come to this video is, right now, you have come to buy a USB drive, and despite the ubiquity and the commonplace occurrence of USB drives in the market right now, it's actually surprisingly complex a subject and one that not a lot of people talk about. So, I decided to make this video. This is an idiot's guide to buying a USB drive in 2024, because it's actually a lot more complex than it was in the past. So, I'm going to get the first thing out of the way straight away in terms of ease. Let's face it, there are some obvious stuff that I think everyone, from your great-great-granddad to your great-great-grandson, that know this about USB drives. These are devices that are connected to your PC or Mac system via USB. You know, different capacities, larger capacities mean more files, and obviously we are going to talk about USB drives, some of which you connect via USB and run straight off that USB, and some require additional power. This video is not going to be talking about the obvious. I don't want to waste your time or mine talking about the obvious. I want to talk about the specifics and the changes and improvements in USB that are really pertinent to buying one now. So let's crack on with our first point.
Your Mac friend, Brent Rambo.
The last few years have seen significant change in what the definition of USB is. Time was that USB 1, USB 2, USB 3 and now recently USB 4 seemed really streamlined. But a few years ago, as USB diversified its portfolio, and that is the organisation USB, diversified its portfolio to maintain different bandwidths or speeds, the result was that it went USB 1, USB 2 and then USB 3 went bananas, and there was lots of different kinds of USB. More of that I'll touch on later in the video. But when you buy a USB drive these days, and it doesn't matter whether you are looking at Johnny Big Bananas brands like Samsung, or you're looking at third-party, lesser-known brands like Arico or something like this, and we'll refer to a lot of this on the table, a lot of them kind of, I'm not going to say trick you, but they certainly make what I would argue is a bit of a stretch in terms of promising, and that is they promote the bandwidth of USB. So, for example, this USB, or even better, this USB drive here is USB Type 4 drive. It can promote 4 gigabytes per second of bandwidth, USB 4. So that's 40 gigabit, and that seems like loads of performance. But the reality is that the connection there and the cable are definitely capable of 40 gigabits per second, or 4 gigabytes of data per second. But the drive itself isn't. They can still get away with putting there on the bottom of their labels 40 gigabits per second and promote that high speed even there on the back of the box. But the drive can't actually hit that speed, and that's because of two things. Number one, the drive inside. The drive inside is going to be an SSD, an NVMe SSD like this one, but these NVMe SSDs can still not fully fill that pipe of performance. When they're talking about the bandwidth, think of that word pipe. The bandwidth is the pipe that you can push all the water through. The actual speed is the water, and these drives can't fill that pipe. They just simply can't, for reasons of efficiency, for reasons of power, for the reasons of up, down and channeling, and the kinds of data and files you need. So do bear in mind, firstly, when you see a lot of these drives promoting their high speed and talking about Thunderbolt doing 4,000 megabytes per second, or USB 3.2 Gen 2 doing 1,000 megabytes per second, make sure they are talking about the speed of the drive, not the speed of the bandwidth. But the second point here, do bear in mind that, again, using this drive as an example, or even better yet, we could look at something from Samsung here. this promotes 2000 megabytes per second, and this promotes here for, I think, 3300 megabytes per second, these two drives here. Bear in mind that although both of these drives are USB Type-C here at the top, not all USB Type-C cables are built equally. And if you don't use an appropriate cable, you are not going to get that speed, regardless of the connection on the rear of the drive and the SSD inside. So, for example, here on the table, I've got a standard USB 3.2 Type-C connection here. It doesn't matter whether I connect this to any of these drives here on the table. I will not be able to achieve more than 500 megabytes per second. Now, there is a USB 3.2 Gen 2 version of that, which looks near enough identical. But if it doesn't say USB 3.2 Gen 2 or a 10G USB connection, either on the tip or on the manufacturer's pages, you're only going to get 500 megs maximum. Now, then you've got USB cables like this with the little lightning symbol. That's a Thunderbolt cable. This is a Thunderbolt 2 cable, and even though it looks identical to that other cable I just showed you, this cable is capable of 4000 megabytes per second via a Thunderbolt connection. But the key word there is Thunderbolt. Remember this drive I said that can achieve 4000 megs? That's only possible if you use a USB 4 cable. That's right. Even though this cable is capable of 4000 megabytes per second, and even though this drive here promotes bandwidth of 4000 megabytes per second, if you use these two together, you'll get 1000 megs, because this is Thunderbolt protocol, Thunderbolt 3 protocol, and this is USB 4 protocol. And you need a USB 4 cable in order to do it. And just remember that USB 4 cables arrive in not only Type-C to Type-C, they also arrive with USB Type-A to Type-C as well. The last thing on those is USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4 cables. Again, these look near enough identical to that Thunderbolt cable I showed you, but they will have the number 4 written on the base right there at the top. There will be the lightning symbol and that Thunderbolt 4. This cable again is capable of 4,000 megabytes per second, just like the other Thunderbolt cable. But this also supports USB 4 and Thunderbolt 4. That means that if I use this with this drive, I'm going to get my 4000 megs. If I use this with a Thunderbolt 4 external enclosure, I will get those performance numbers. So just bear in mind about the speed of USB protocol and that the cable you are using is the right kind.
I feel the need for speed.
Going on an ever so slight deviation on that subject of performance once again here, it's also worth highlighting again that these drives here that I've got on the side of the table, the reason I've piled all these up here is they've all kind of got a similar barrier to a lot of first time buyers, and that is that the drive inside is not the same as the performance promised outside. This, for example, is the T5 Evo from Samsung. This is a USB, as an 8TB USB 3.2 Gen 1 or old style USB 3 external drive. It's powered via USB, so you don't need an external power, but it can only hit 500 megs. And to their credit, Samsung do say as much. They make it clear that it peaked there at 460 megabytes per second of sustained performance. However, the SSD inside this can achieve speeds of well in excess of 2000 megs, maybe even 3000 megs. But the enclosure, for the sake of the convenience, as useful as it is, has bottlenecked that performance. Another great example is this one, the Samsung T9. I know it seems like I'm ragging on Samsung, but hear me out. This drive here, again, the SSD inside is, where is it? The Samsung 980 Pro architecture of storage. This drive can hit thousands upon thousands. The Gen 3 version of this can hit 3000 megs, and this drive can hit 7 gig per second. This, on the other hand, can only hit 2 gigabytes or 2000 megabytes per second, as indicated on the bottom of the drive. And the reason being because of the external connection. The external connection on that there being USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. One of the worst USB connections, by the way, for reasons I'll touch on later on. So, a lot of the time, if you don't even need that much more money, but if you're prepared to get your hands a little bit dirty and you care that you want to make sure you get the most of the drive performance inside your USB, rather than going for a pre-made USB enclosure like those, go for an external enclosure. An external enclosure like this one. This is the Arico M2 USB 4 enclosure. This arrives at around $80 to $90, and this is an empty case. It's just an empty USB case. It's got that 40 gig USB connection, but this arriving in several colours allows you to install one of these. Things like the WD-Red SN700, 3000 megabytes per second. You'll get that performance. Drives like the AdGain. This game here in an 8 TB drive, knocking around for about $499. Again, an expensive drive, but 8 terabytes of storage. Put it in that, you're going to get 4000 megabytes per second. The list goes on. So if you are looking at an external SSD and you want to get the full extent of the performance of the ports and connections of your Mac or PC system, rather than going for a pre-built drive, I recommend going for an empty USB enclosure that promotes those higher speeds. Again, like a 20 gigabits per second here. You can get this and get yourself a high performance SSD like this and give yourself a huge amount of performance at a lower price, really importantly here, than the Samsung offering, which is a combined complete solution. You pay less money for higher performance. So do bear that in mind about leveraging the internal and external performance of a USB.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
We can't talk about all of this performance and bandwidth and all great speeds of your data without also talking about another issue that has really grown every single year for about the last 7 or 8 years since the use of SSDs and external enclosures has become something of a growing trend for content creators, and that is heat. These drives, particularly the high performance ones that take advantage of USB Type 4 and Thunderbolt 3 and 4, they get hot. Not just the drive and its onboard little components like that, they get hot. But the actual enclosures get hot. The reason they get hot is drives like these will take advantage of heat sinks, either strategically placed on individual chips or arrive internally with a metal plate. This metal plate connected to the drive inside is connected via silicon paste or silicon pads. These silicon paste and pads draw the heat that's being generated from the individual components here on the SSD, draw them into the top of that metal panel and dissipate them into the air. However, if that drive is inside an enclosure, there's nowhere for the heat to dissipate, so it stays in the system. That leads to two things. One, a drive getting bloody hot in your pocket or on the desk. But number two, it could be detrimental to the performance of the drive. And the drive can throttle its performance, that is lowering the performance, in order to cool itself off, because you don't want the drive to break under those heats. Now, in the recent few years, thanks to the growing improvement of SSD performance, external enclosures have come up with different ways and means in order to counteract the problem. And the two most common ones are as follows. Number one, fan-assisted enclosures. Ones like this one and this Eno one here, which again you can get pre-made drives like this, which have not only a metal external enclosure, but they also have a fan built in, powered by the USB port, which also allows the heat to be dissipated as quickly as possible to maintain the temperature level and ultimately let the drive work as good as it can, as fast as it can, for as long as possible. But the problem is, those USB-assisted fans require power. Additionally, they have more components and therefore they increase the price. So more affordable brands or brands that are looking to make economical choices have gone another way, and that is to turn the entire external case into a heatsink. What you're looking at here is a giant version of what I showed you earlier. This is dissipating all of the heat from the SSD into the surrounding air. that comes up with one advantage and one arguably massive disadvantage. The good advantage is that's a huge amount of dissipation there made possible on every side. This alleviates huge amounts of heat from the USB Type 4 drive inside and allows that drive to not worry too much about the detrimental effects of throttling and kind of protective heat minimization. However, this case gets crazy hot. When I used this for about 40 minutes for video editing back at the end of 2023, I couldn't put this in my pocket without burning my leg. That is how hot this gets, because this is drawing all of that heat that it can as quickly as possible, and because of the lack of a fan on it, that heat isn't being dissipated in an artificial fashion. It's relying on passive organic heat dissipation, which is nowhere near as fast. The result is that when you are looking at external drive enclosures, and this also includes, by the way, those Samsung ones I mentioned earlier on, which the faster the performance, these get hot as well, but these come up with, say, silicon protection panels, more on those later on. Ultimately, do bear in mind that high performance USB drives are going to get hot. So just keep that in mind, and depending on how you're going to be utilising them and carrying around with you, make provisions for that.
And modern problems require modern solutions.
Carrying on from that previous point, if we're going to talk about heat generation and means by the drive to dissipate that heat, we've got to talk about power consumption, because as alluded to earlier, that drive that's got a fan on board, that requires a decent bit of power to be included alongside the USB power being drawn from the client system to get the job done. But there's more to it than that. Anyone that's ever been using Thunderbolt drives for the last few years, you'll know that Thunderbolt on your Mac or Windows system is a surprisingly power-hungry connection. Whether you're using it for storage, using it for displays, using it for a docking station that connects other things, you know that Thunderbolt could be quite a greedy little connection. And the result is that some USB drives are actually quite power-hungry. Not just the lecky bill when your British Gas comes in and you go, how much? But moreover, that when you're connecting, it's actually drawing system resources away from processes like your video editing, like your photo editing, like whatever you're gaming or whatever you're running on the system. It's drawing some of those CPU resources and a little bit of RAM and even some GPU in the case of Thunderbolt 3 and 4 towards the support of the Thunderbolt connection there. It can be quite annoying. And moreover from that, when you are looking at some of the higher performance USB and Thunderbolt connections that we talked about thus far, it's worth highlighting that if it can't draw the power, or you're running a mobile system with power saving settings or battery saving settings in place, what can often happen is a drive that is capable of 40 gigabytes per second, if you go into a power preservation mode, or you're not running off of mains power, that drive will suddenly halve its performance because it can't draw the necessary power to fully support the drive. And even then, if you're using an old class USB Type-C port that supports only USB 3.2 Gen 1, then when it's drawing from there, it won't even have access to the power requirements, and sometimes drives like this with the fan on board simply will not run. So just be aware of power saving settings, battery saving settings, and moreover, if running an external Thunderbolt drive is going to be using too much power for your day-to-day utilization, go for those middle range 1 to 2000 megabytes per second connections if you need to counterbalance power consumption versus drive performance.
If you type Google into Google, you can break the internet. So
this next point is about USB 3.2 Gen 2, the weird connection in the USB family. Now, I'm not going to make a big story time sit by the fire point about this, but a number of you may have noticed, and again, I'm going to allude back to that Samsung drive I talked about there, the Samsung T9 released at the tail end of 2023. This drive supports USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. Now that is a 2000 megabytes per second connection. But when you look around, there's actually not a lot of devices that have this connection. There are out there, and definitely devices released between 2019 and 2022, you see this connection a lot, but these days you simply don't. Regardless, Samsung released this drive at the end of 2023. Watch the full review, I'm still as confused as you are. But bear in mind that drives like this that promote 2000 megabytes per second unless you are specifically using USB 3.2 Gen 2 systems, which by the way, as mentioned, there aren't a lot of, the result is you are never going to achieve that speed. Moreover, USB Type 4 and Thunderbolt 4 connections, a lot of them do not support auto negotiation down to that particular connection. They'll support auto negotiation down to 5 gig USB and even 10 gig USB, but lots of them do not support USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2. The whole reason for USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 coming into effect was because of shortages of Thunderbolt cables and connections. There were hardware shortages of not only the PD power delivery chips used in Thunderbolt, but also a lot of the main components utilised by Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4. And the result was, just before and during the pandemic, there were not a lot of components available for Thunderbolt. So the USB conventions opened up USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 onto a lot of motherboards because there was no point, or there wasn't the hardware components available for USB 4 and Thunderbolt 3 and 4 available. So for that period, we saw a lot of devices with this 20 gig connection. But as the components have become more varied towards Thunderbolt and USB Type 4, and the general availability of all of the components has increased, this connection has been largely abandoned. So just keep that in mind. If you're looking at drives that are 20 gigs per second USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2, triple, not double, triple check that the connection on your system are either this connection or that you're running USB 4 or Thunderbolt 4 that actually has auto negotiation down to that connection.
That is brand new information!
Finally, USB protection. I don't know if you guys have looked at mobile phone specifications these last few years, but you may have noticed that the majority of modern high-brand mobile phones now are classed as waterproof, insofar as you can drop them in the bath, you can drop them in the sink, and they'll work fine. Why is that? That's because in the majority of cases, when it comes to inlets, you have a bit of audio in and out, which have protective meshes, but they only have that USB port. Do you remember when a lot of us complained about the lack of an audio in and out? That's one of the main reasons they removed the phono socket there on the base. When they removed the audio socket there for your earphones, it was to ensure the devices could be protected from dropping in water and the ingress there. Now, the same is applied to USBs. The majority of USB drives I've shown you today only have an input for that USB. You look at them all, they've removed the majority of inputs in any way. And alongside that, the protection levels and the way to quantify protection on USBs has changed quite significantly in the last few years. So if you're looking for a drive with a decent amount of protection, you need to look at two main variables. There are others such as shock, motion and more, but the two you need to look at are drop protection and IP, otherwise known as ingress protection. You need to go for a drive that is at least IP65 if you want protection from dropping in water, light to medium moisture and dust. If it doesn't have IP65 or higher, because the two numbers there are quantifiable of dust and moisture, if it's not IP65, 66, 67 or even higher, it is not going to be protected from a lot of those accidental slips. Now, all of the drives I have here on the table have a rating of IP65 or higher, but when you look at that figure and you look at that protection level, some of them are playing very fast and loose. This one here, for example, is IP65. Look at that fan. That's going to let in all kinds of ingress. The same goes for a lot of drives like these Samsungs. A lot of these are protected all over the place, but it's the drop protection they are talking about more, and that is when they've coated the drive in silicon or high protective rubber there, and that means you can drop it 2-3 meters down and the drive will be fine. Now, I would say the fact you're using SSDs that don't have the moving parts of a hard drive, that's carrying a lot of the weight of the protection, to be honest, because if you dropped a hard drive in the past, there's a lot of moving parts here to break. Whereas with SSDs, there's far fewer. Doesn't mean it can't crack or chip the PCBs, the little chip and the board it's on. But I would still argue that a lot of that drop protection comes down to the internal hardware, really, than it is the external. But in some cases, and again, I like this drive, I've reviewed this drive, it may already be live here on the channel, but I will say that this drive having a lot of drop protection and ingress protection, they're playing very fast and loose with what I think is fair, because you only can really count that if, when utilising this lovely minor high performance drive, that you choose to use a protection slip. And this drive, which is designed around looking real pretty, because it's a lovely looking drive. It's called the Beetle. It's based on a Scarab Beetle, giving you that high performance. The only way you can achieve the reported ingress protection and drop protection is if you use this horrible rubber case. It arrives with this rubber case that you have to put around it, and if you don't cover this drive in that rubber case, which sort of makes it look a bit cheap and foam shoppy, then this isn't protected by what that drop protection and ingress protection is. So when you're looking at USB drives and wondering about the protection they have from drop, moisture, dust and more when you're on the go, or when they're in the pocket where your lint is and some coins scratching it, just keep in mind that a drive manufacturer may heavily promote high levels of ingress protection and drop protection, but only if you're utilising rubber casings that a lot of these drives seem to arrive with. So there you have it. Those are probably the most important things to know about buying a USB drive in 2024 onwards, for those of you that have not really kept up with how things have changed in this arguably very mainstream storage format. If you want to learn more, there'll be a detailed guide linked below over on NAS Compares to go through all the points we've discussed today, as well as going through some of the other fundamentals right now. This seems like a really straightforward topic, but there's actually a lot of things that have happened in the last few years, and we talk about it a lot here on the channel. So I recommend checking out the reviews for all of these drives here, as well as for the SSDs over here. If you need further assistance, you can take advantage of the free advice section on the right hand side of every page at NAS Compares. Use our Discord or the community forum at ask.nascompares. Alternatively, use our Patreon or Ko-Fi Coffee page if you wish to not only get access to these videos early, but get through to content polls and exclusive content not available online here on the channel normally. Finally, you can hire myself or Eddie via Zoom consultations, via Ko-Fi or Patreon. It's nice and simple. It's one of the options at the top. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.